So when we left off in the book of Esther last week, chapter 5 left us with a cliffhanger. In fact, somebody said that to me this morning. They were talking about the cliffhanger of chapter 5, that they can't wait to get to the next chapter to find out what's going on. Because if you remember, chapter 5 ended with Haman going to his wife and his friends, and he had been so happy to be invited to Esther's banquet, and he talks about the wealth that he has, the children that he has, his social status as second in the kingdom. But he says, I cannot be happy as long as that Jew Mordecai sits at the king's gates. And so his wife, Zeresh, decides that maybe a good idea is to set up a pole 75 feet high and to have Mordecai impaled on it first thing in the morning. Now, of course, that means Haman's got to go and talk to the king first thing in the morning to get his approval to have Mordecai executed. There's a problem with that because Esther is not going to appeal to the king until the evening of the next day. And so before she ever has a chance to talk to the king, Haman has a plan to have Mordecai put to death. And it kind of leaves us with this cliffhanger that even when times seem really bleak, is God going to do something about it? Is God going to help us out in this situation or help him out in that situation? And chapter 6, it all just turns around. It's a beautiful chapter, right? In the center of the book. Everything after this chapter is going to be more positive, where everything prior to this chapter has been very bleak in what's going on. But we begin to question, will God be faithful to his covenant people? Is Mordecai going to be spared? Or and how is that even going to happen? I think we might have all found ourselves in those difficult moments in life where we can't figure out how we're going to get out of this situation, or what is God going to do in this situation. And from the outside, or from a worldly perspective, it doesn't seem like there's a way out, right? It doesn't seem like there's any way that Mordecai can escape what's about to happen to him, because Esther is not scheduled to talk to the king till the evening. Now Haman's going in first thing in the morning. So without any divine intervention, without providence, there's going to be a question of whether or not Mordecai is going to be saved. And what we see as we go through this chapter is there's some things that we might just say, well, that's a coincidence. And then there are other things that we have to say, no, that's providence, right? And the question as we look at this chapter is, what is it going to be? Is it divine accident, or like a happy accident, or is it providence? Is God doing something behind the scenes to bring about his purpose? Now, we all know what coincidences are, right? It's just when two circumstances happen and they coincide and they have nothing to do with each other. It just looks on the surface as if they do have something to do with each other. Where providence is God working behind the scenes to carry out his purpose. Whatever event happened was ordained by God. He stepped in to make sure that happened. And that's what chapter 6 of Esther should cause us to consider, because, of course, we're on the edge. Is Mordecai going to be saved, or is Haman going to get to the king in time? And some coincidences happened that day. Starting in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, that night the king couldn't sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read before him. So the king has a sleepless night. Have you guys ever had them? Yeah, we have sleepless nights. Every time I drink coffee a little bit too late, I have sleepless nights. It's just circumstances, right? But in this king is unable to sleep. Now, I think part of the reason he's unable to sleep is he might be a little frustrated with Esther. I mean, she came before him, risked her life to petition him about something, and then she just wouldn't tell him what it was. And so he's on edge, like, what is it that this woman might have wanted that she'll risk her life to come before me? And so he goes to the banquet thinking at the banquet, at her first banquet, I'm going to find out now what the petition is. And he promises her up to half the kingdom. But then she says, come back to a banquet tomorrow night, and I'll tell you what my request is. So I kind of think the king is setting up at night, just kind of frustrated with all this. Like, why won't she just tell me what she wants? Obviously, it's important. She risked her life. Why won't she just tell me what she wants? And so, despite all the different ways that kings could go about this, he decides to have a book read to him, right? You guys, anybody here a fan of the Calm app, where they read to you at night? It puts me to sleep like that, right? And I kind of think that's what the king was going for. He has he has a book brought out, and not just any book, probably the most boring book he could find. It's a record of the chronicles of his reign, right? It's just a book recapping whatever happened to him that week, or in this case, 4 or 5 years ago, right? But it just happens. It's just a circumstance that as he can't sleep, he orders the book, and the person, the attendant that begins to read to him, reads the story of how Mordecai had saved his life from the assassination attempt by his doorkeepers. What a coincidence, right? On the same night that Haman is deciding that he's going to have a pole erected 75 feet, and he's going to petition the king in the morning to have Mordecai killed, well, that's the same night that a king opens a book and finds out how Mordecai saved his life. What a coincidence. But then he asks a question he probably should have asked 4 or 5 years ago, right? What has been done for Mordecai? What reward has been given since he saved my life? And the attendant says, well, nothing. Nothing has been done. And so now he asks his second question, because this king seems unable to make a decision without consulting other people. He asks, well, who's in the courts that I can talk to? What a coincidence. Haman happens to be in the courts. At the same time, the king wants to find out what should be done for the man that the king delights to honor. Now, why is Haman in the courts so early in the morning? Right? Like, if the king is having trouble sleeping, that means this is at least, in the early morning of the hours, early morning hours that Haman shows up. Most likely, Haman showed up so that he could get the first appointment to meet with the king that day about killing Mordecai. What a happy accident. On the same night that the king is trying to figure out what he can do to reward Mordecai for saving his life, is also the same night that Haman is stayed up trying to figure out how to execute him. And he just happens to be in the court when the king asks what should be done. Now, the king says, well, send for Haman right at once so that we can figure out how do we reward the one that the king delights to honor? And so they bring Haman in, and he asks in verse 6, it says, when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Haman's so great. Listen to what he says. It says, now Haman thought to himself, right? We get a picture of what Haman says in his heart, right? What he says on the inside. This is what he says. Who is there that the king would rather honor than me? Right? This is the only time in the book that it does this. It gives us like an inside look to somebody's, like, what they feel on the inside. It's just so full of pride when it comes to Haman. Who would the king rather honor than me? So instead of saying, well, it depends, king, who is it that you want to honor? He just says, this is what should be done. Now, in the Persian Empire, when they would reward somebody for loyal service, typically it looked like, here's some money, or here's some land, or here's an official status, like those kind of things. But since Haman believes that it is him that is about to be honored, well, he already has money, right? And he's already the second highest official in the kingdom, and he's probably already got land. So Haman comes up with a plan that suits himself, right? Listen to what Haman wants. He assumes that the king wants to honor him, so he says, for the man. Now, of course, this is verse 7. So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Right? Now, just to be honest, I'd probably rather have the land, the money, or maybe a higher position in the kingdom. But Haman has all those things. He's got land, he's got money, and he's the second highest in the kingdom. And because he believes the king wants to honor him, he kind of wants to dress up and play king for the day. Doesn't that? It's a coronation service. Like in that culture, robes meant something. That's why all the brothers were mad because Jacob gave his son a coat. Right? Like robes meant something and horses meant something. And it was like this status symbol. And Haman wants honor. So dress him up like a king, put him on a king's horse, and lead him around the town, saying, this is what the king does for the one that he delights to honor. But it just seems to be a happy accident that it wasn't Haman that the king wanted to honor. Instead, it was Mordecai. So the king says this, I wish, you ever wish you could be a fly on the wall of a room? You could just see what it's like. I wish I could see Haman's expression when the king said this. Verse 10, go at once, the king commanded Haman, get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew. I think you could have heard like a pin drop in that room. Like Haman's heart just falls out of his chest as he just heard the one that he can't stand, the one that is like the last chapter says, I cannot be happy as long as that Mordecai is alive, right? As sitting at the king's gate. The one that he is his enemy, he now has to honor. There's also an interesting part of this verse because you notice that the king knows that Mordecai is a Jew, and he doesn't seem to have any issue with the fact that he's a Jew, which kind of shows how Haman's been underhanded throughout this whole thing, coming up with the edict, right? He doesn't tell him that it's the Jews he wants to go after because, well, Haman told the king that it's in his best interest not to allow these people to live. But the king doesn't seem to have a problem with Mordecai the Jew. In fact, now he knows that Mordecai the Jew has actually saved his life. Haman does everything that the king commanded, and I'm pretty sure he wasn't very happy about it as he just led Mordecai through the streets on a horse that the king has ridden, wearing a robe as Mordecai wore a robe that the king has worn, saying, this is what is done for the man that the king delights to honor. I'm sure he was biting his tongue the whole way. In fact, once they're done, in verse 12, it says, afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. He was seriously depressed about this situation, right? He was running home with his head covered, just so sad that he had to lead Mordecai through the streets. Like what a coincidence, right? Or maybe is it providence? We have to decide, which one is it, right? The king's awake. He can't sleep. The book is brought out. It happens to be the right page. When he asks for help, Haman happens to be in the right place. We could look at all these things and say, man, that's just such a coincidence. But maybe it's more, right? When he gets to his wife, even his wife changes her mind about the whole situation. Remember in the last chapter, his wife was like, you should have a pole set up 75 feet high and have Mordecai impaled on it. Now, listen, in verse 13, it says, and he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends, everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Right? Even she changes her mind about it. As long as this person is a Jew, you're not going to be able to do anything about it. And then in verse 14, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. I just would have to wonder, do you think Haman was quite as excited about the second banquet as he was the first? I mean, it'd been a day like a day like no other for Haman, man. He woke up early, or maybe stayed up all night after building this pole in the air to go speak to the king about having Mordecai put to death. And now instead of that happened, he's got to lead Mordecai through the streets, saying, this is what happens to the man the king delights to honor. He goes home in shame, and I think he even returns to the banquet feeling a little bit of shame, right? Just doesn't seem to be a very good day for Haman. But as we look at it, we could look at these events and say, what a coincidence, what a happy accident. Or we could say that God works behind the scenes to accomplish his purpose. That's what we call providence, right? And that's going to lead me to my first point. My first point is, what we think of as coincidence might be God's providence. What we think of as coincidence might be God's providence. And I have to this point comes with a caution, right? Because I am not in any way saying that everything that happens in life is God's providence. Some things are just coincidence, right? That's just how it works sometimes. It's sometimes I wear this blue shirt. Sometimes Steve actually shows up wearing the same blue shirt as me, right? It's just two events that coincide. and they have nothing in common. Like they have something in common. So it seems as if it was planned, but man, there's no deeper meaning behind that. Often in life, there are just coincidences, but sometimes in life, things happen for a reason. You can't look at this chapter and say, man, those are just a bunch of happy accidents, right? It just doesn't work. In fact, let's go through some of the coincidences. The first coincidence is that the king was up that night. The same night Haman wanted to have Mordecai impaled, the king is up. The second coincidence, he brings in the book. Do you guys usually read when you can't sleep? That's what you do? I try. Personally, I tell January, turn off the light, because that's usually why I can't sleep. But I try really hard to go to sleep. Reading a book does not top my list. Listening to the book might. So I understand where the king was coming. But, the king had a myriad of ways to entertain himself if he can't sleep at night. He could have brought in musicians. He had a harem to his disposal. There's lots of things the king could have done. He decides to bring a book, a boring book at that. And when the attendant reads, it just happens to be the page that talks about how Mordecai had saved his life. God's time, well, it's just, if it was just a sleepless night, coincidence. If it was just reading a book, coincidence. But when all these things stack up, you have to accept that maybe something is happening outside of just coincidence, that what we're talking about is providence. In addition to just those things, when the king asks which official is outside, could have been any of the officials, but it just happens to be Haman, who was there to talk about Mordecai, the same one the king wanted to talk about. Coincidence or providence? All these things add up, and it just makes us realize that sometimes in life there is coincidence, and sometimes there is providence. God does things behind the scenes to accomplish his purpose. I have to say, mostly when I look at my story of coming to Christ, there's no way it would have worked out had God not been behind some of the events that happened. Now, of course, I had to be responsible to make sure that I responded to the things that is happening in front of me. And often people aren't responsible, and so what God is trying to do, they completely ignore. But I look at me coming to Christ. I tried other churches. We got married at a Baptist church up on Edmonds. And there's no reason we shouldn't have just started going to that church. But January started working with Ken's daughter, and next thing I know, we're going to this church. And I didn't want to go. I didn't, she woke me up, and my wife is a strong-willed person, and she got me to go to church that day, right? I don't know why. But I think God is working behind the scenes. And I know that to be true of some of your stories as well, because I've heard your stories about finding a track at the right time. Or John's story, I wish he was here, of falling down the stairs at the church right under the cross and saying, well, maybe I should go to that church, right? Those kind of things, as you think of them, is it a coincidence or is it providence? It's hard to know, right? Now, I can't just say that this happens with good things, because unexpected and unfortunate things happen too, right? Unexpected things happen all the time. There is death and sickness and sorrow. And Esther's life is a good story about that too. She is an orphan. Her parents had died. She is taken to the king, forced to spend the night with him, made to be queen. And Mordecai says to her, perhaps you're in this situation for just a time as this. As Christians, we accept that we don't understand all the ways God works. And it would seem easier to understand if everything was a miracle, like bread coming from heaven or Jesus breaking a few loaves and feeding the multitude. But God often works in these ordinary ways, like sleepless nights, reading the right book at the right time, running into that person at just the most opportune moment. God is working. We have to be responsible in those interactions, but God is working. Our role is to trust. And that's what Esther does. She trusts, right? She's willing to go in front of the king. That's what Mordecai does. He trusts. That's what we should do. We don't always know the why of things, but when we live responsibly, we know that God works all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his promise. And God is working in the background. And you have to step back and look back on your life to see that. It's not so obvious whenever you're living it, right? It just seems like a sleepless night. It just seems like a meeting. It just seems like some advice. My second point is God's timing is always perfect, right? God's timing is always perfect. And you can see this in this chapter. There's the obvious parts of it, like Haman is there in the courts at the exact moment that the king is looking for advice on how to reward Mordecai, right? The exact moment. God's timing seems always perfect. But I don't know that it seemed perfect to Mordecai, right? Because it was in chapter 2, if you remember, it was in chapter 2 that Mordecai had saved the king, right? It was the 7th year of the king's reign that he made Esther his queen. And after that, we read a story about how Mordecai uncovered the plot to have Xerxes assassinated. And the very next chapter says, and the king promoted Haman to the second highest position. And reading it seemed awkward because Mordecai had done the good thing, yet Haman is the one who's elevated. And you're wondering, like, why didn't he get some kind of reward for being a loyal citizen? I think Mordecai probably wondered the same thing. When the edict goes out to have all the Jews in the kingdom assassinated, men, women, and children, the text tells us that Xerxes was in his 12th year. So if you can do some Bible math, he saves the king life in the 7th year. In the 12th year, the edict goes out to have all the Jews assassinated, and sometime after that, the king decides to reward Mordecai. There's quite a few years between those things, aren't there? Like 4 or 5 years? I mean, Bible math is always subjective, I guess, but there's some years, and I think in those years, Mordecai was wondering, like, why didn't I get the reward that I deserved? How come it didn't work in my time? We live in a culture that's all about our time. We want things our way, right away, right? And Mordecai had to wait. In fact, more than just wait, he may have even given up hope that he would ever get any kind of reward. But then, on the same night that Haman is plotting to have Mordecai executed, is the night that the king realizes that he never rewarded Mordecai for what he had done. God's timing was perfect. Mordecai may have not have thought that, but God's timing was perfect in a way that saved his life. I wonder sometimes, like, because I am a person that wants things in my own time, what kind of things do I just get frustrated and do things the wrong way, right? Like Sarah, where she, I'm not having children. Try my maidservant Hagar, because she got impatient. I often think of myself getting impatient quite a bit because, I want things that I believe that God wants in me, but I want them now. May not be God's plan right now, right? James, the letter of James talks about this. Of course, the biggest thing that Christians have to be patient on is when it comes to Jesus' return, right? We're waiting, like, in eager anticipation for Jesus to come, and James has to remind us to be patient. In James chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, it says this: be patient. Like, that's one of the harder commands, right? Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and then the spring rains? You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you'll be judged. the judge is standing at the door, right? I mean, James is writing to a group of people that are struggling with the text. The subheading is patience and suffering. They're suffering in certain ways. And James has to tell them, like, look, Jesus is going to come, but in his own time. You just be patient and faithful while you wait. I think that's something we can learn here, is that God's timing is perfect. And we have to be patient because whatever it is that we're waiting for will happen in his time and not ours. Third point is that God is going to turn things around. And this chapter is the chapter where those things begin to happen. It's right there at the center of the book. And God begins to turn things around. There's a few things in this chapter that we can see God turning things around on. If you look at verse 10, it says, "Go at once," the king commanded, "get a robe and a horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Don't neglect anything that you've recommended." Like, Mordecai has gone from being overlooked to now being honored, right? In addition, Haman is the one who has been honored in the first part of the book, and now he's the one going home in shame, right? That's what verse 11 says. So Haman got a robe and a horse, and he robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man that the king delights to honor." Do you remember last time Mordecai was in the streets? Sackcloth and ashes and mourning. And now he's going through the streets, robed in the king's robe, not sackcloth, and being honored. Verse 12, "Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman returned home." Up to this point, it's been Haman that has been honored, and now Haman is returning in grief. See, God turns things around. You can see it throughout all the Bible stories, right? Sarah wasn't able to have children. She becomes the mother of Isaac, the one that's going to bless the nations. Jacob was sold as a slave. He becomes the second, or Joseph was sold as a slave. He becomes the second highest in the Egyptian kingdom. We could keep going. David, everybody overlooked David. He wasn't even there when Samuel came to find which child of Jesse was going to be king. He wasn't even there. Nobody even thought that he was that important. He's just David out there. From the one that everybody overlooks to the king of Israel. The one that embodies that, like, you kind of see the whole messianic hope, the root and the offspring of David. You've got Esther, once again, from being an orphan and being taken to the second highest in the kingdom, or to be the queen, right? God has a way of turning things around. You see that in Mordecai. He goes from mourning in the streets in sackcloth and ashes to walking through the streets with the king's robe. He is turning things around. Jesus says that's kind of what he's come to do. In Luke chapter 4, verse 16, it says this: "He went to Nazareth," he being Jesus, went to Nazareth where he'd been brought up. "And on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom to the prisoners, the recovery of sight to the blind, and to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor.'" You see how he turned things around? Sight to the blind, freedom to the prisoners, hope for the oppressed. Then Jesus rolled up the scroll, gave it to his attendants, and set it down. In the eyes of everyone in the synagogue was fastened on him, and he began to saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Jesus came to turn things around, right? Just as Mordecai's life is being turned around, the rest of the chapter or the book will show how God turns things around for the Jews. I don't know, whatever it is, like, we can talk about coincidence and providence, and sometimes things in life are difficult, and it's hard to go through those difficult moments. But we have a God that turns things around. I think as I just read this chapter, And I'm going to close with this thought. It's something that Haman's wife actually says. That I think I don't know what happened. In the last chapter, she wanted to have Mordecai impaled and put on a pole. In this chapter, she says this: since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. Like, maybe in the last chapter, she didn't know Mordecai was a Jew. She just figured he was somebody that her husband didn't like. But for whatever reason, she recognizes that because he is a Jew, you're not going to be able to overcome him. He is going to be the cause of Haman's downfall. I think in what she says is something that's really important. See, we've been wondering as we've gone through this book whether or not God is going to be loyal to his covenant, to these people who were not loyal to him. And she says that God seems to take care of the Jews. He seems to honor his covenant promises. And that's true of our God. He is full of loving faithfulness, right? He is a faithful God, true to his word. And he's being true to his word, his promise to Abraham, his promise to Moses, that he would protect them, the blessings and the curses of Deuteronomy. He's being true to it here. But we're in a covenant too with God. We're under this new covenant. As we heard this morning, the old is gone, the new has come, right? And the new is so much better. But we can be confident that God is loyal to his covenant promises. Even when people, like the Jews, have not been loyal to God up to this point, but God continues to take care of his people. And since Mordecai, whom you are going after, is of Jewish origin, you will fail. That's what she says. Why will he fail? Because God is loyal to his covenant promises. The same is true for us. God is loyal to his covenant promises. And we're under that new covenant, instituted by Jesus, right?